When you live along the ocean, it's not uncommon for remnants of the past to wash up along the coastal beaches. Sometimes they're simple pieces of wooden ships. Other times it's artifacts or shells or the bones of sea creatures. But what if the ocean washed up something entirely unexpected? What if it washed up a man? Some stories blur the line between reality and the unfamiliar. They whisper in the night, waiting to be heard. So let's listen. Let's talk spooky. Welcome back, spooky souls. I cannot believe it is almost midway through January. I feel like time lately is just moving way too quickly. But at the same time, I'm a little done being buried in snow. So if we could just skip ahead to springtime, that would be great. Now, if you are just coming across our little spooky podcast, welcome. Here at Let's Talk Spooky, we do just that. We talk and explore all things spooky, creepy, mysterious from different parts of the world. So if that is your vibe, take a moment, hit that follow button, and join us each Thursday as we explore a new spooky topic. I had a lot of good feedback about the vampire segment, which you can find the links to part 1 and 2 of those episodes in the description box below. If you guys have any other creatures of the night or day that you wish for me to explore, or locations that you want to hear more about, leave your request in the comments, and I'll make sure that we feature them in some upcoming episodes. Canada has some amazing locations and stories to explore, and I want to share more of them with you all. So, again, if you are a Canadian, say hi. I know it's hard because our fingers are frozen, but give it a try. Tonight, we're going to visit the coast of Canada's eastern province to a small town off the Bay of Fundy near Digby, Nova Scotia, called Sandy Cove. And this story is a weird one, guys, and it will leave you drawing your own conclusions about what really happened that fateful day when a man named Jerome found himself on the beach. So light a candle, get cozy, and let's talk spooky. It was late in the summer of 1863, and as two boys walked along the cliff's edge, they looked out at the sprawling beach in front of them. It was the kind of morning where the fog clung low to the shoreline, and the tide breathed in and out. The boys were barefoot, curious, and bored, and the quiet routines of the village were just not enough for them that day, so they wandered a little further down the beach than usual. Hopping over stones, sticks, and seaweed, they kicked driftwood, daring each other to go closer and closer to the water's edge. And that's when they saw something ahead. It was tucked slightly inward, close to the base of the beach, and at first the boys believed that they might have stumbled on a bundle of driftwood. Or maybe something had washed up by the tide, a sack, maybe? Making their way over to the object, they were startled to see that it was not debris at all, but a man. He sat slightly upright against a boulder, and as the boys approached him, he almost seemed to not notice their presence. He continued to stare out dreamily towards the ocean, but as the boys got closer, they noted that his complexion seemed pale, and it looked potentially like he might be close to death. They spoke to him briefly, but the man gave no answer, and that's when they realized one more thing about the man. He had no legs. There was nothing but 2 stumps just above the knee. Concerned and slightly afraid, the boys ran back to their village to find anyone who could assist in helping the mysterious man. And when the villagers came, it seemed clear that this was no ordinary shipwrecked man. To understand why Jerome's appearance felt so unsettling to the Maritimers, you have to understand more about where and when he appeared. The village itself, small but practical, was a close-knit community located on Sandy Cove, a small coastal village on the western shores of Nova Scotia. Facing the open waters of the Bay of Fundy, the men who worked here worked the waters. They hauled nets, they caught cod and herring, and they built and repaired boats between seasons. The women of the village managed home, helped preserve food, and stretched resources across deep and long winters. Children learned quickly that the water was unsafe, and it made no promises, and not to venture too close to the unknown. So for the two boys to find this man sitting seemingly out of place brought a bit of concern to the community. Though strangers were not uncommonly placed, it was rarely a mysterious thing. People passed through port to port. Shipwreck survivors generally arrived with their story etched across their face. Traders went with purpose. And everybody had kind of an origin, a reason, a narrative that fit their arrival. So why didn't this man? When he was found sitting upright and facing the water, he appeared almost as if he belonged there. Not washed up, but placed in the very spot he sat. Perhaps a shipwrecked sailor. However, when the reality of his body became clear, it made that theory of him being a castaway very unlikely. There was also no evidence of body drag marks, as if he had pulled himself out of the water. The biggest flag for them, I suppose, was that both legs were not amputated in a way that looked like it was roughly done. It actually spoke of skilled hands, surgery that required knowledge and care. And at that time, even for wealthy people, such procedures were dangerous and not commonly done. And the mortality rate was incredibly high, mostly due to infection and long healing process. So the fact that this man had lived through such a procedure suggested that he had once been a valued man, protected potentially by a system capable of keeping him alive. But again, how did he get there? The community responsibility outweighed their suspicion. They couldn't just leave him on the beach. So they welcomed the strange man, who they called Jerome, into the village. He was taken in by different households over the time he was there. He was moved through the community, cared for, and he seemed to understand the languages that were spoken around him. He reacted to certain words with emotion, but he never told his story. In fact, he never spoke. In a place where history is generally passed down through voice and memory, oral storytelling and tradition, his silence was rather loud. And the years turned to decades, and nobody claimed him. Railways arrived, medicine advanced, the world moved forward, and Jerome just stayed silent, in place, as though he still sat on that beach, unmoving. When he passed away in 1912, he left behind no explanation, no record, and nobody to claim his identity. Only a life that was intersected briefly between the people of this small Nova Scotia village. But this is where I want to venture from the shores of the facts and navigate into the deep waters of folklore. As the years passed, the man on the shore ceased to be merely just a man. He became a whisper of oral tradition. And those whispers were held in low voices, and sometimes the truth would shift depending on who would tell the story. At first, most clung to an acceptable reality. People said that he must have been a castaway off a merchant ship. Perhaps he was punished in a way by damaging his ability to speak. Sailors talked of mutiny, theft, or a refusal to obey that might have cost him his legs, his name, and even his place in the world. The sea, they said, was kinder sometimes to the men who worked upon it, giving reason to why he may have survived the odds. Others claimed that Jerome had refused to speak because perhaps a vow he had taken, that he may have been a religious man, and that he had sworn himself to silence as an oath or penance for something that he had done long before the people of the shore had found him. They pointed to a way that he would stiffen when certain words were spoken, how his eyes would darken when ships were mentioned, and how glimpses of anger would cross his face and then vanish just as quickly. Some wondered if he had once been a wealthy man, maybe an important gentleman sailor, perhaps the son of one. His posture was always well upright, he bared good composure, and he never begged or pleaded. He simply accepted the care that was given by the village with dignity. And then there was the manner of his skilled amputation. You see, a man of nobility could likely afford such a surgeon. But as stories do, the longer he remained in the village without being claimed, the more the stories and his potential origin grew darker and more strange. Some began to believe that he was not abandoned at all, but simply placed on the beach that day. Maritime superstition is deeply rooted in the life force of the ocean itself, so it's not a far stretch to believe that the ocean could have decided his fate. Villagers who witnessed his rescue claimed that the tide never quite touched him. It always seemed to stop short, as if obeying an unspoken boundary. Children, as they do, would dare each other to walk past his window at night, convinced that he could see beyond worlds, that he might have been a witch. Then there was talk that he knew when storms were coming, that he would grow restless when rough weather was approaching, that he would gaze out to the horizon long before storm clouds would ever appear. Fishermen superstitions by necessity, and they paid attention to him. Silent invites stories, and it creates a space where certainty should be. And there was no certainty when it came to him. He never corrected anybody, he never denied the legends that were told about him, and he never confirmed them either. He just refused to explain the proof of where he had come from and why he was there. And that explanation, or the lack of explanation itself, was a dangerous thing. By the time the children grew into adults and told stories themselves about this man, Jerome was no longer just a legless man found on a beach. He was embedded into the landscape as part of the mystery of the maritime area. Though historians have tried to fit the pieces together of his identity, it's never stopped the village from making up their own explanations. One of the main published works we use to focus on our research for this episode is called Jerome, and it's written by a historian called Fraser Mooney Jr. And it really essentially strips away the dramatic explanation of something colder and darker taking place. The amputation, certainly medical, so it was unlikely that it was done on a ship, a merchant ship especially. And Jerome had survived such a major surgery that at the time of survival was so unheard of for that level of potential for infection that alone demonstrated that he was likely a man of importance. It was not a mutilated, out of rage situation. It was treated well, and it was given dignity. And that was just not seen aboard most maritime merchant ships of the era. Mooney traced the ship's routes and immigration patterns and medical realities of the time, and his conclusion suggested that Jerome was likely a European sailor or laborer, with the possibility that he came from Mediterranean background. He became injured or ill or disabled, and in a system that had no room left for people who couldn't work, he was simply just discarded, brought somewhere where they believed that he would be cared for, and left on the shores where someone might find him alive and take responsibility where they didn't want to, which I think is much more sad of a reality than any folklore had officially built for him. Silent because silence was safer than explanation. Seen this way, Jerome's muteness was no longer regarded as a curse or a vow. It was simply a form of survival. trauma-based, a language barrier in order to keep him safe, a choice to withdraw from the world that had already decided that he was no longer useful. In the case of extreme traumas, silence itself can become a form of survival. We see this in cases of children who experience deep trauma. We see this in individuals as adults who experience deep trauma. And what researchers recognize now is that trauma-related or self-imposed muteness occurs when speech becomes associated with danger. Rather than the inability to speak, the person may be physically capable of language, but withdraws entirely, sometimes for years, sometimes for decades, sometimes for the rest of their entire life. And this response is often linked to shock, fear, or a need to regain some kind of control over a situation that they had lost control of. In historical context, especially more modern psychological understanding, silence is not recognized as the trauma, but the association with the trauma. So it appeared unsettling for most because at that time in that century, the understanding of deep psychological impact was not as commonly known. So his silence brewed more fear among the villagers, more suspicion among the villagers than essentially it would have if the understanding of deep trauma had been a little bit more widespread of that time. So because he still sat facing the sea, he refused to tell his story. He believed for decades that he lived among these people with these unanswered questions and it was okay. It's not surprising that modern legends of him still linger to this day because he was a very big staple in the maritime community as something that was just unsolved, a way they could make sense of what was not making sense to them. So people said that the spot where he was found, if you walk along the beach of that area, when the fog rolls in and the dampness is there, that there's a heavy feeling, almost as if his presence is still there, and it feels almost unwelcoming. Like maybe the ground had absorbed his sadness. Perhaps it's the final blend of truth and myth, that he was not a ghost ship that was drifting endlessly through the waves, but in some ways he might have been a human-style one. He was disabled, unclaimed, and returned to the sea without an understanding of a destination or an explanation of a course. Though history tells us how he survived, folklore tells us why his story is still so unsettling. Along the shorelines near Sandy Cove, the story of Jerome did not arrive fully formed. It grew through both coastal folklore, as the way most things that are unexplained do, and slowly layered by time, shaped by silence, and darkened by history that could not be essentially answered. At first, people said the sea had returned him, the water of the Bay of Fundy unknowingly gave back something that it didn't understand, that he had been rejected from somewhere in his past, and that here he found a place carefully above the tide line, that he was alive, that he could not build a home, but exist among people who had accepted his presence. It's really, in many ways, a story of survival. And over the course of generations, people's whispers about the man who survived was really built into folklore, not just because he showed up out of nowhere, because it seems that he was never meant to live at all. From his amputation to his abandonment on the shores of an isolated community, he should have never made it multiple times, and yet there he was, still surviving and still overcoming, but not sharing how or why. And in a community that had such deep superstition, it's not surprising why stories over the course of generations shifted, changed, and became embedded into the sand itself. He lived to the ripe age of 75, and for a man of that time and all of the situations that he seemed to have gone through, that is an incredible feat. And I can see why folklore began to suggest that his muteness was not an injury, that his words themselves were kept because of his fear of endangerment. And the people's conversations around him, they failed to ask the questions because they might not have really wanted to know the answers. By the time older witnesses had passed, the folklore that carried Jerome somewhere else entirely. He became a figure caught between worlds, not claimed by the land entirely, rejected by the sea, but seemed to be facing the water and always waiting to go home. Parents would warn of his story, sailors spoke of him in low voices, but he was no longer just the man who arrived on the shore. He was proof that some lives slip outside the order of natural things. And yet, beneath the layers of legend, there did run a quieter truth. And history offers that to us. There was really no curse or omen or supernatural cause. Though we always hope in folklore as we go through these creepy stories that there is truth to things. And in some cases there is. There is an underlining story that folklore seeds from. It does offer us instead a world where an injured sailor was discarded, where an institution had failed the disabled, and where a silent trauma followed, but gave survival still. Survival because a community came together and made sure that this man was not abandoned again. So, though folklores can turn to warnings and history can recognize neglect, the stories, they don't escalate because they're scary. They escalate because there's so much more unanswered questions that keep piling on top. So at the end of the day, when the records end and memory took over, when the explanation failed and meaning stepped in, and historians began to look deeper, where water and land met and folklore and fact became blended, it was less of a ghost with unanswered questions and more of a man who had simply been forgotten by the world. When he died, his life concluded, much as it had begun, with a quiet formality. There was no detailed obituary. There was no confirmed grave marker. The villagers had placed him where they had placed their dead for many years. He had arrived on the shorelines of Sandy Cove without an identity or documentation, and essentially he left the world the same way. And what followed in his place was folklore, speculation, and modern retellings. But it doesn't distort his story, it preserves it. And that's what folklore and the beauty of folklore does, is it takes something ordinary and embeds it into the unordinary. In the absence of documentation, our memories step in. Silence creates a space where we're able to kind of understand him in a way that makes sense to us. He didn't become a ghost. He was a figure shaped by a history that had failed him. And today, when the fog rolls in along the Bay of Fundy, his story is still told to tourism. Not because it's supernatural based, although there is aspects that they place in there, because it's unfinished to this day. And it reminds us that survival is not always a resolution, that kindness doesn't always require understanding, and that some lives are simply remembered for what they give and not where they originated. Jerome left no explanation behind him, only a shoreline, a community, and a question that history may never close. And that's all I have for you guys tonight. I hope you enjoyed our little journey into the unknown on the shores of Nova Scotia. Next week's episode, I am excited to get a little bit creepier. and we're going to explore some of Canada's most iconic ghost ships and some of the very, very creepy stories that have been attached to them. So if you haven't, take a moment, hit that follow button, leave a comment, say hi. Let me know what you think about these episodes, if you enjoy them, if there's anything you wish to change. Please always be kind. I'm just a girl behind the mic, so no hate, please. And I look forward to talking about ghost ships and the unknown next week. So, without further ado, stay curious and stay spooky. Until next time, bye-bye. This episode was written, researched, and produced by me, Shauna, and the team here at Let's Talk Spooky. If you have a spooky story that you want to share, please email us at letstalkspookypodcast@gmail.com. And don't forget to check out our socials. We're on TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube. So give us a like, a follow, and say hi.